Hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. B, and we are going to be continuing our discussion on the open economy by talking about the theory of the open economy. So as we explore the actual theory, keep in mind what we just talked about with respect to the open economy. We talked about surplus, we talked about deficit, as it relates to open economy. As you know, with an open economy, we have the flow of goods and services, and we have the flow of financial instruments across borders. The financial instruments being reflective of stocks and bonds and other investments in direct foreign investment. That is the concept of an open economy. So the model of the open economy shows us that there is a trade balance and an exchange rate across economies that do trade with each other. The trade balance is reflective of exports minus imports, getting us net exports. The exchange rate is the exchange of the financial instruments, meaning the actual currency between two nations. That is the exchange rate. So, for example, if I exchange one US dollar, I can get 100 Japanese yen. Or if I exchange one US dollar, I could get 70 euro cents. If I exchange one US dollar, I can get $1.10 Canadian. If I exchange one US dollar, I can get 7 pesos. I think it's probably higher than that, but last I knew, right? That's called an exchange rate. And looking at this, we know that economies run simultaneously. So looking at trade, looking at exchange rates, these happen at the same time. Okay. So we look at a lot of ways that these can be influenced. Trade balances and exchange rates, of course, can be influenced by policy of the countries. It could be influenced by the trade balance. It could be influenced by the nominal exchange rate over time. And all of these really have an impact on what we call the open economy. So looking at the open economy, and this probably looks a little familiar, our open economy represents savings equal to domestic investment plus net capital outflow. Supply of loanable funds is represented by savings. So when you hear loanable funds simply means the currency that I can lend out to someone or to a company, right? If you're a bank and you can lend funds, those are loanable funds. How does a bank lend money? Where does the money come from? The money comes from us, the savers. Okay, so in your savings account, the currency is not actually in that account at the bank. It's there virtually, right? It's represented in your bank account. If everyone went to the bank at the same time and withdrew all of your savings, the bank's not going to have enough cash to pay everyone, okay? Because the actual cash is sitting somewhere else. But the savings represents loanable funds. The bank uses your cash and lends it to others in the form of a loan. That's why we call savings being represented as the supply of loanable funds. The demand for loans comes from domestic investment, stocks, bonds, and then, of course, other tangible investments, and the net capital outflow of a country. When the net capital outflow is greater than zero, it's said to have a net outflow of capital. Makes sense. In this case, we have our purchases of capital overseas. In other words, I'm purchasing funds from other countries. This adds to the demand domestically for loanable funds. When my net capital outflow is less than zero, the capital is coming from abroad. The demand domestically goes down for loanable funds. Loanable funds are generated domestically based off of what is available for capital accumulation. This comes from savings. The purchase of capital assets comes from the addition of demand for loanable funds, the assets being located domestically, investment, and the assets being located abroad, net capital outflow. So if you think of assets as being stocks, bonds, or other tangible assets, property, plant, equipment. With loanable funds, there's typically a higher real interest rate. Makes sense. Anytime there's a loan involved, the interest rate is going to be higher than it would be naturally, because the bank's got to make money, right? There's an encouragement of people to save, I think, because it increases the available of loanable funds. Your bank might offer you this thing called a interest savings rate. The interest on the savings rate simply means that the more money that you save in your bank account, the more interest the bank will pay to you based off of your savings. You might think to yourself, well, how can the bank, afford to give me anything on top of my savings? Or why is there an interest rate attached to my savings account? That money comes from them lending money to other people, right? That's where the cash is coming from. This discourages investment when the real interest rate is high, because there's a decrease in the amount of loanable funds. It also discourages Americans from buying foreign direct assets. It reduces net capital outflow. In other words, there'll be less, when there's a high real interest rate, there's going to be less investment from Americans in foreign assets. Like, I'll buy less stock in Toyota if the interest rate is high when I ultimately sell it. It also encourages foreigners to buy U.S. assets because it reduces net capital outflow. Graphically, the supply of loanable funds is upward sloping and to the right. The demand for loanable funds is downward sloping and to the right. And of course, just like any other wonderful graph that we have in economics, there's a point of equilibrium. And the equilibrium represents the interest rate. And at the point of equilibrium, we have the amount of people that want to save. We have the exact balance for quantity for the amount to be lended out. And of course, we have net capital outflow. And this is what it looks like. The point of equilibrium is where the real interest rate exists. The supply and the demand that are represented here. And the way to think about it is like think about cash at the bank. The bank has the cash from the savers. The bank lends that cash out to as loans. And the interest rate is set by a point of equilibrium. The amount of cash the bank has, and the amount of interest, or the demand. The amount of cash that the bank has, and the amount of the demand for loans. That's how the interest rate is set. Of course, there's always going to be a market for foreign currency exchange. Foreign currency exchange, as we've been talking about, is when I need to exchange my American dollar for another currency, like the euro. If I go on vacation to Europe, I need to exchange my American dollars for euros so I can purchase goods and services in Europe. That exchange is done on the market. I go to the bank, I say, I need euro. How many euro you need? I tell them the amount, I give them the American dollars, and I get my euros from the bank. It'll be less because of this thing called an exchange rate. The exchange rate is the difference between the currencies. The exchanges are set by the net currency outflow being equal to net exports. If there's a trade surplus between the countries, where the exports are greater than the imports, the sale of goods and services abroad, Americans typically use the foreign exchange to buy the foreign asset. That makes perfect sense. If I have and the reason for this is because when there's a trade surplus, it means the dollar is stronger than that foreign currency because we have more exports than imports. More cash is flowing abroad. So in this case of a trade surplus, and the American dollar is stronger than the foreign currency, the American dollar leaves the country to purchase the foreign goods. So cash is flowing out of the country. That cash outflow is greater than zero. The opposite, of course, is always true. If there's a deficit, it means my imports are greater than my exports. And if I am going to go abroad, the spending that I'm going to do is going to be financed because the dollar will be weaker, and so I'll go to the bank, exchange the currency, and so cash is actually coming into the United States. That currency outflow is less than zero. And of course, there's a supply of foreign currency exchange. This is where the quantity of the dollar supplied to the foreign assets is represented. So when you go to the bank and you use your US dollar and you exchange it, where did the bank get that currency from? Right? So if I go to the bank and I say, hey, bank, here's my American dollar, I need a euro. The bank has the euros at the bank. That's called supply. They have the supply. And it's represented as net capital outflow. It's quantity of dollars supplied by foreign assets. So in this case, the supply curve is called vertical. Yeah, vertical, up and down. It's a quantity of dollars supplied for net capital outflow, and it doesn't depend on the real exchange rate. All it does is, instead of being dependent on the foreign exchange rate, it's dependent on the demand, supply and demand. So the demand for foreign currency is based off of net exports, and it's downward sloping to the right, and it results in a higher exchange rate. the higher the demand. Makes goods and services in the United States a little bit more expensive. And the quantity of the dollars demanded is typically lower. There's less currency flowing into the country. And just like everything else, there's an equilibrium point where the supply and demand for dollars are in balance. And here's what it looks like graphically. The supply of dollars is vertical, and the demand for dollars is downward sloping to the right. And there's a point of equilibrium. The point of equilibrium is called the real exchange rate, where the supply equals the demand for dollars. When there's equilibrium in the open economy, it helps us to identify the market for loanable funds. The market for loanable funds, as you know, is the demand for loans from banks. It's based off of the savings rate. So the formula for the market for loanable funds is simply that savings equals investment plus net capital outflow. Which also says that the market for foreign currency exchange is the net capital outflow equals the net exports. So the net capital outflow curve is linked between the market for loanable funds and the market for foreign currency exchange. Equilibrium. Yeah. And this is what it looks like graphically. Don't worry too much about that graph. So the market for loanable funds, again, it's what's the demand for loans at the bank? How do we find the demand? It's called a market for loanable funds. The supply comes from the savers at the bank. The demand comes from domestic investors. The equilibrium is represented by the real interest rate. Net capital outflow is downward sloping to the right, and the equilibrium is represented by the interest rate. The market for foreign currency is supplied by the net capital outflow. The demand is represented by net exports, and equilibrium is represented by the real exchange rate. The real exchange rate is based on the price of goods and services in the present time. Of course, it changes over time, right? That's why exchange rates, they go up and down every second of every day. The equilibrium of the exchange rate is based on the price of domestic goods and services. These adjust simultaneously. So, as I said, the equilibrium goes up and down every second. So they adjust simultaneously the equilibrium and the real exchange rate. And of course, this is done to balance supply and demand over time in both the foreign and domestic markets for loanable funds and foreign currency exchanges. With equilibrium and the real exchange rate, adjusting simultaneously, it also helps us to determine in the future national savings, domestic investment, net capital outflow, and net exports. It's kind of like a benchmark, if you will, or a key indicator. And this, of course, represents graphically the supply and demand for currency based off the real exchange rate for loanable funds and for the net capital outflow. Oh, sorry. A little too fast there. Now, with the open economy, the government spending has a significant influence on the available funds. Government spending from budgets, deficits. Here's what happens. In the United States, especially, our government runs a serious deficit. It's because the government spending is greater than the government's revenue. Government revenue, as you know, comes from taxes. We're spending more than we're taking in the form of taxes. That's a problem. This causes negative public savings, reduces national savings, reduces the supply of loanable funds, makes it harder to get bank loans. It increases the interest rate, which is what you'll be seeing over the next few months, and it reduces net capital outflow. These deficits also cause crowd out in domestic investment, in other words, less domestic investment. It also decreases the supply of foreign currency exchange. The currency appreciates in value. US dollar goes a little bit further. There's a net exports decrease, and there's a push in the trade balance toward a deficit. These are all results of government over spending more than what they're taking in. And so a lot of this, what we're talking about right now, is exactly what we're seeing in 2021. We're seeing less foreign investment, less domestic investment. You'll soon see higher interest rates. We're already seeing higher inflation rates. And, it's all because the government is simply spending more than they're taking in. And they've been doing it for years and years and years, and now it's just getting worse. So what do governments do in order to help to rectify the situation? They implement trade policies. These trade policies influence the quantity of goods and services available in the marketplace based off of what a country imports or exports. And these are further controlled by this thing called tariffs. Tariffs, as you recall, are taxes on imports. With taxes on imports, those taxes get paid directly to the government as a form of revenue for the government. Some governments impose this thing called an import quota. It's a limit on the number of imports. And that is simply because they want to protect what is made nationally. And sometimes there are also voluntary export restrictions that companies place on themselves in order to meet these quotas. The policies, especially when it comes to import quotas, they decrease imports over time because there's a limit to how much we can import. It increases net exports, hopefully. It also increases the demand for dollars in the market for the foreign exchange currency. And import quotas also cause the real exchange rate to increase over time and discourages exports. So the import quotas can be very detrimental to an economy. Over time, there might be no change in the real interest rate, and no change in net capital outflow, and no change in net exports, which ultimately lead to decrease in imports and decrease in exports. So quotas, they could be good to some degree. The reason why quotas happen is because the country wants to protect what's being made domestically. An example would be years ago there was an import quota on Japanese-made cars. You'd only bring in so many from Japan in a given year. And the reason for that was they wanted to protect the auto manufacturers here in the United States. How does that happen? You protect the companies manufacturing cars here in the United States by limiting the number of cars being imported from other countries. It basically forces people to by what's being made domestically, indirectly, of course. So our trade policies have a lot of impact on what is happening around the world with respect to trade. So net exports equal net capital outflows when there's savings minus investments are the same. But trade policies primarily impact firms, industries, countries, so pretty much everyone. All the things that cause those types of situations with respect to policy include things like political instability and capital flight. Capital flight happens when money suddenly leaves the country for whatever reason. This happened in the United States some years ago when there was a change in tax law, which caused U.S. citizens to open banks accounts in the Cayman Islands to evade taxation. That's called capital flight. It's when capital leaves the country. Also happened in Mexico back in 1994 when there was a lot of political instability. A lot of Mexican assets were sold and purchased by United States investors. This caused a net capital outflow in the United States, where the supply of pesos in the market of foreign exchange dramatically increased. So that was an interesting time. Capital flight affected both the United States and Mexico. The interest rate in Mexico substantially increased because, of course, the demand increased. It reduced domestic investment, so the Mexicans weren't investing in themselves. It slowed capital accumulations and slowed economic growth. The value of the Mexican peso decreased over time, made exports cheaper, and imports much more expensive. And the trade balance went forward toward a surplus. That's what happened in Mexico in 1994. It's always interesting. So in Mexico, it affected the United States as well, of course. There's a fall in net capital outflow in the United States. The dollar appreciated in value at the time. The interest rates fell because the dollars were leaving the country, going into Mexico to purchase assets. And in comparison, there was a smaller impact on the United States than there was in Mexico, simply because of the size of the two countries in respect to their economies. And this causes currency manipulation. Some countries manipulate their own currency by limiting the amount of currency in circulation. This is very, very common in China and other dictatorship countries. They'll manipulate the value of their dollar to benefit their people to some degree. It's always interesting. Okay, it is 7 o'clock. Any questions at all on the open economy, the theory of the open economy? Anything at all? Y'all good? Okay. All right, I'd like to remind you very quickly. This week, there are 2 assignments. Week 13. Week 13. You got 2 assignments. Chapter 18 quiz on the open economy. Chapter 19 homework on the theory of the open economy. Next week, we got 2 chapters, 20 and 21. The following week, the last 2 chapters, 22 and 23. And then week 16 will be the final exam. So the last day of class is December 5th. Today's November 15th. The time goes by very quickly. I encourage you to please do the work early. as early as you can. Don't wait till Sunday night to be trying to do 2 assignments. Come on, you know better than that. So try to do a little earlier. I promise you, it'll save you some stress. I know I get stressed out when I got a lot due on one day. So, if in the meanwhile, if you need help, if you have questions, please feel free to email me, call me, set up office hours. I'm here for you 100% of the time. So, as always, I would like you to stay safe, wash your hands, do the right things, and I'll see you all again next time. Thank you all so much for your time today. I appreciate all of you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.